Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
It is a great pleasure to welcome you back to Part 8 of our 10-week series that's titled A Journey in Search of the Human Spirit. On our previous programs, we've been in conversation with famous people in history, and we want to continue that with 3 today. But before introducing our famous characters from history, I want to thank the Idaho Humanities Council once again for their generous grant that they've given us that's made this possible. In fact, this is the 6th year in which they have done so. We thank them very, very much. And now it's time to welcome 3 famous people from the past to our studio. First of all, we welcome John L. Lewis. Mr. Lewis lived from 1880 to 1969, and he was a major force in organized labor in the United States. In fact, he was president of the United Mine Workers of America from 1920 until 1960. Mr. Lewis, welcome to our studio from the past.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And our second guest today is the very famous King Alexander the Great, who lived from 356 until 323 BC, was known as the Great King, a warrior and a promoter of Greek culture and the works of Aristotle and Homer. Alexander the Great, welcome to our time and to our program.
Thank you.
And our third guest is Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519. He was a Renaissance person, artistic genius. He's often described as such for his paintings, his sculpture, his architecture, and his interest in science. Welcome to our program, Mr. da Vinci.
Thank you much, Tony.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at Idaho College. And Steve, we'll invite you to talk first to our famous people from the past.
Thank you, Tony. Well, first of all, gentlemen, let me say that we're honored to have you in our studio today. And I'm always delighted that you speak English, because it would have been a real problem for me to do these interviews if it hadn't been for that skill that you possess. Unfortunately, I'm not a very good historian, and I'm sure there are others in our audience like me who recognize your names. You're great people from history, but don't know a great deal about you. So what I thought I'd do is ask you to begin by each giving us a bit of a brief history of your lives and some of the highlights of your accomplishments. Mr. da Vinci, can we start with you, please?
Yes. Well, in a few minutes, it's very difficult to compile and truncate the amount of work that I've done in my lifetime. Yet there are some key points that I would like to impress upon you. My childhood is a very important time for me, and I view it as a time which I began to cultivate my skills and my eyes, my ability to think, to see, to draw. It was a wonderful time of learning as I explored the world and was taught by nature, seeing the extraordinary aspects of life and movement of water and wind and formations of mountains and trees. And that time was very beneficial for me. As I grew up, I found myself in Florence, my childhood years spent near Vinci. And in Florence, I became an apprentice for Andrea del Verrocchio, who was a fairly successful artist at the time, and he showed me many techniques and just familiarized me with the art as a more formal discipline. And I excelled greatly under Verrocchio. Later, being commissioned by Ludovico Sforza in Milan, north of Florence. He was the Duke of Milan. And there I worked as an engineer and an artist under the Duke. I began to compile my work in notebooks, studying nature, science, the physical world, and capturing my observations down in hundreds, what became thousands of pages of my manuscripts. I began to work on paintings officially being commissioned by different monasteries. An example would be The Last Supper, as many of you have heard of. I worked on a large bronze sculpture for Ludovico, unfortunately never was completed. Later, returning to Florence, I was received as a son by the people And there I was contacted by Caesar Borgia, who was heading the Papal Army. Some of you might be familiar with him as the prince who Niccolo Machiavelli, an associate of mine, wrote to. There I was the engineer for the army, and I surveyed the land. I drew many maps. I examined architecture, fortresses, all the while examining my own fields, studying flight, movement, light, shade, many, many aspects of art and the natural world. Later on, I went to paint the Mona Lisa, which, as the two I've mentioned, I in all completed about 17 works, but many of the works that I did engage in, I never finished, which became an unfortunate habit of mine, but I would quickly lose interest and pursue my studies instead of being bogged down by these limiting projects. I found myself in the Vatican for several years. It was a very disappointing time in my life, working for Giuliano de' Medici, and unfortunately I was rejected, not socially, but people deep down recognized that I was an outsider. And King Francis I, though, accepted me as a patron during the last years of my life, and that's where I ended my life in France.
Thank you very much. Your Majesty?
I conquered the world, and you're expecting me to tell you things in 2 minutes?
Pick a small corner of it that you'd like to particularly talk about.
Well, I was born in Macedon in 356. That is north of Greece. Macedon was not part of Greece. It is now, thanks to my father, Philip II. And the thing about my childhood, I didn't have a wonderful childhood. It wasn't peachy, squeaky clean. It's amazing that I'm as normal as I am now. But my father was a master of the military. He had an eye for what needed to be conquered, how to conquer it, and that his genius lied in that talent. However, he was a barbarian, and I disliked him extremely. I found him to be rustic in the culture, in the arts, something that I grew quite fond of due to my mother. Some say she was a witch, possibly. I loved her. I loved her extremely. She had her eccentric ways, but I think she taught me to love the arts and the culture, and she's the one that had Aristotle come and teach me, be my tutor. And I learned a great deal from Aristotle on the human nature of man, the wrongs, the rights, what a human being really was. And I think that's where I began to actually love the human spirit. But I also had the talent from my father and the love for conquer. And he had his eyes set for a place called Persia, which was across the Hellespont, which is now part of the Mediterranean Sea, but you have Greece, and then you have Persia, which is now Turkey. But he died. He was murdered. Some say my mother killed him. If she did, she probably had reason to. So I finished his vision, I guess you could say, and I think I surpassed him in military genius. And I crossed the Hellespont in 331 with the notion to conquer, but not just conquer. It wasn't my idea to conquer a nation and to treat it as a lower class. I wanted to bring something to the world. And at that time, that was the known world. As far east as anyone had ever gone, I'd gone the furthest. I'd reached the borders of India after conquering Persia. And I wanted to unite the Persian and Greek culture. I just didn't want to bring the Greek culture, the Hellenistic culture, to Persia. I wanted to unite them, because I had a great love for Persian art, for Persian dress. Persian dress was one of my favorite. I liked the Greek dress, but I preferred Persian dress. I loved dressing in Persian clothes. It was, they had class. It was almost like, what is this, the Giorgio Armani or something? I don't know. I was at the store the other day. It was weird. But anyways, they're like that, I guess you could say. I conquered Darius III. He was the king of Persia. He was a great man. I respected him immensely. He wasn't a genius in military. That was his downfall. I surpassed him. I defeated him finally at Gaugamela, which was the decisive victory, and he had 5 times the men as I did. I had 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, which I led. I always led the cavalry. I was a master at the horse and the sword, and I always stood out in front. I did not watch my men go into battle. I led them, and that's why we are who we are. And I think that's why they love me, and I think that's why they followed me to the ends of the earth. It's because I treated them not as equal, but I treated them with a great respect, and I wouldn't be here to this day without my men. And sad to say, I think I was a little bit of a disappointment to myself when I reached the borders of India. My men finally, they did not tell me in so many words that they wanted to go home, but I could see it, I could sense it. They'd been gone from their families for over 20 years. And I looked up at the stars, and I realized that I could not conquer all that was out there. And I thought that was my biggest disappointment, my biggest flaw, was I could not do all that I wanted to do.
Thank you, Your Majesty. Mr. Sullivan? Or excuse me, Mr. Lewis. I was thinking of another John L. there for a minute.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with both of you great classical gentlemen. And I've always been a great admirer of everything that you both of you accomplished. My home was filled with works of your art and history. Would that my adversaries in government and in the unions would have had some of the culture from the classical period. The working men and women of this country would have been much better off, and we would have had more social justice and more progress in our nation. In a few minutes, let me say that I was something of a man. Forged and molded in the mining crucibles in the state of Iowa. My father, my uncles were all employed in the mines. Mining was all we ever knew. And consequently, I was born to the pits, so to say. Early on, as a child, my father became involved in union activities and was fired and blacklisted for his union activities. And as we wandered from town to town throughout Iowa looking for work in the mines, the blacklist followed him, and I'll never forget that. I did try some other things as a young man. I formed a co-op with some friends, but that didn't work out. I started a grain mill. That didn't work out either. And so I started a theater for plays and traveling shows, but that wasn't very successful either. I traveled throughout the western part of the United States and working in mines in Arizona, in Colorado, and Wyoming, and then came back home to Lucas, Iowa, to marry the most wonderful person I've ever known, my wife, Myrta Bell, whose father was the doctor. That was 1907. That very same year, I ran for mayor of Lucas, only to lose because my father-in-law campaigned against me, having greater ambitions for me. Murda and I moved to Panama, Illinois, where I went back to the mine and down into the pit, and I became involved in union activities again, and this seemed to interest me a great deal. I worked hard, and so hard, in fact, that the AFL and the United Mine Workers took note, and within a couple of years I was promoted to be a union organizer. That took me out of the mines, out of the pits forever, but it put me on the road forever. And I traveled from Arizona to the hills of Virginia, Pennsylvania, always trying to organize the miners. For 10 years I did that, and I worked hard. And then the breaks came my way, and with a little bit of political maneuvering, I was able to get myself elected as the president of the United Mine Workers of America. That was 1920, and I'd hold that job for the next 40 years. I suppose I should tell you something about the things that motivated my work. The situation that the miners lived in during the 1920s was beyond imagination. The independent mine operators owned all of the houses, they owned the stores, and so the miner and his family were subjected to living in the worst, most squalid conditions, paying high rents, buying all their clothes. The miner had to buy all of his equipment, everything, and he was indebted to the mine forever. The mine owned the miner and his family. And the independent mine operators prevented any kind of union activity, arming mines with machine guns and all kinds of hired thugs, and we had to stop that. In 1925, I wrote a great book called The Miners' Fight for American Standards. I pointed out, trying to influence the government and the American people, that wherever the United Mine Workers had been successful and were establishing union mines, we raised the standard of living. We helped the new foreign miners coming in from other countries become Americanized, become American citizens. And we emphasized always that we wanted the best conditions for the American people, that the United Mine Workers wanted to end the exploitation. We'd never take a step backward. And in doing so, we were speaking in unison with the heartbeat of America, and we gave the strongest voice, the strongest economic voice to that. And that's the very spirit of America, is improving the standard of living.
I'm going to interrupt this time so I can ask a question. We're 2/3 through the show. I think this is a historical record for us, Steve, with less time for questions, but that was fascinating, 3 stories. I have a 2-part question for each of you, and I'll start with you, Mr. Da Vinci. Our theme is a journey in search of the human spirit. And everyone that has been invited to be with us this week while we did this has a special understanding of the human spirit. So my first part of my question, then I'll get the second part, and then the other two will have the same question. And that is, people like yourself are set apart from others in history. A unique group of people, a small percentage that accomplished so much. What was internally part of you that motivated your human spirit to exceed far beyond what the average person accomplishes in a life? Where did you get your drive? How did you perceive the world that made you so different?
Fascinating question. Looking back my lifetime, it seems that I was captivated by an intrinsic desire to know, and that was my motivation. I wanted to be universal. I would write in my notes, "I shall continue." It required me to study diligently. No time for slothfulness, no time for lack of diligence. And I was always looking for that universal understanding of the world. And it led me through so many different areas that in order to gain what I wanted, that understanding, that knowledge, the grasp,
in all these different areas,
I had to penetrate into the depths of each field.
I wish we had time to pursue much further. Time is really running by, but one just quick, like 20-second answer. So, of everything you did, what would you put first as your greatest accomplishment?
I would have to say the synthesis of knowledge, that we were rediscovering new fields, and I showed and demonstrated how truly it is easy for a person to be universal.
Thank you. Alexander the Great, the same question. What motivated you to have such a remarkable career and accomplish so much, even far beyond what your father did? What was the driving force that caused this? What set you aside as different and special?
My passion. My driving force was I loved culture. And I could almost say I wanted to know more about the world. I wanted to see things. I wanted to not only conquer, but I wanted to, as I stated earlier, I wanted to unite. I wanted to bring cultures together, and I wanted to see how they were. And I wanted to do that through battle, which was sadly, but it was the only thing that I could attain it with, was through force. But it was also through respect through the other side, which was as what someone else might call the villain. We were the good ones, they were the villain, but they weren't, because they ended up following me as well, and it was my passion.
And of all the things you did in history and the culture and bringing different cultures to those you conquered, what do you think was your greatest accomplishment?
You're not going to believe this, but I think my greatest accomplishment was I had a friend. That was it. I actually had a friend that I could talk to.
So it was the human aspect.
It was the human aspect.
Mr. Lewis, the same question. What made you rise to the top, really? And you're one of the most powerful union leaders in the history of the United States. Where did that come from? What kind of drive? What set you apart?
I think it comes, Mr. Stewart, from the circumstances and situations one finds himself projected into. And working in the mines and in the mine unions and seeing the terrible way that poor people were treated motivated me to believe that I could do something to correct this, to end this exploitation, that I could form unions, that I could unionize all of the working people, all of the working men and women. And that was my motivation. That was my drive to do that.
Same as I've asked the other two great people in history. Now that your life is over and you have a perspective to look back at it, what was the one thing was your greatest accomplishment that you've been best remembered for?
I would have to say that it was forming and starting the union known as the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, because that unionized all of the industrial workers. Were prior to that, only the craft unions had been organized, and they were concerned only about their own specific area. But creating that one big union and then seeing it continue on and finally becoming united, that was, I think, I know, my biggest accomplishment.
One final thing, since you're the most current one in history, you had friends in politics and you had falling outs in politics, so you never did follow one particular political line, did you, as far as certain political leaders are concerned?
No, I really didn't. I had been a member of the Republican Party. I had been a member of the labor committee in the Republican Party. And then with the start of the Great Depression in 1929, by 1932 I had become disillusioned with the Republicans and the policies that they were continuing to use, and so I attached my political affiliation to the Democrats and to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but I would become disillusioned there too,
and fall out with them too. Our time. It's been fascinating. Our time is just about up. I'm going to have you break character. We tried that with our viewers, and let me just introduce who you are. We'll start with John L. Lewis. You're Ken Palo, and Ken Palo is a retired school teacher from the state of Washington, and he's the former chair of the Democratic Party in Spokane County. And Ken, this is, I believe, the third character you've done, and thank you for doing this. I might have time to get back to you. Then Alexander the Great has been played by Colin Angela, and he's a student at North Idaho College, and he is majoring in two fields, theater and political science. And again, this is your first character with us, but you've had a lot of wonderful theater productions, and you're a very, very gifted actor. And then next to him is Chris Porter, who's also a sophomore at North Idaho College. He has had 2 years experience now of doing character, and again, I'm amazed with how much information that all of you have concerning your character and what you retain. And the feedback I get from the public is that they feel like they've really talked to this person in history, and we congratulate you. You put in hours and hours of work. And Steve, that's why I'm so proud of our students. Aren't these great examples? For those who claim that good things aren't going in public education, they need to take another look at the whole process. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We thank all three of you, and this has been a great treat, not only on the show, but also watching you perform at North Idaho College. And because of you, we have a higher quality, and we thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again next week when we're going to continue our journey in Search of the Human Spirit in program number 9 of our 10-week series. It soon will be coming to an end, and from our input from you, we know that you've been really enjoying over the last few years our doing famous historical characters, and we're so proud of those people, both locally and across the country, who've been part of this series with us. And again, be with us next week when we will continue our journey in Search of the Human Spirit. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.